So, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Today we are going to discuss this portion of the spinal cord chapter, that is the muscle stretch reflex. We have talked about one type of receptor till now, that is the muscle spindle, and the muscle spindle is having a type of reflex which is known as the muscle stretch reflex. Let me show you this by a diagram. So this is a general pathway. You can see the fibers are originating from the muscle spindle, and a sensory nerve is going. This nerve is having one alpha fibers, and it is going in the posterior horn, and then the posterior root, which is the sensory horn and the sensory root of the spinal cord, from where it is having a synapse, and it is coming out from the anterior horn and the anterior root of the spinal cord. So this was the sensory pathway, this was the motor pathway, and the motor nerve now comes and innervates. And for the extrafusal fibers we have A delta type of fibers. For the intrafusal fibers we have the A gamma type of fibers. Now this is the whole pathway for the muscle stretch reflex. The muscle stretch reflex is monosynaptic. You can see there is only single synapse that is having in the anterior horn of the spinal cord. So what will happen? Whenever your muscle is stretched, this reflex is going to go from these spindles to the spinal cord, and from there a motor response will be originated. Now the dynamic and static stretch reflexes. The whole reflex can be divided into two types of the reflexes. As I told you, for the dynamic stretch reflex, which is a fast occurring stretch reflex, these fibers are only going to come from the primary endings, whereas for the static stretch reflex, that is the slow one, prolonged one, which takes place for a longer period of time, the primary and secondary both endings will be involved. So coming back to this diagram, we can say that in the static one, the primary and secondary both will be involved in the afferent pathway. But in the dynamic one, only the primary endings will be involved in the afferent pathway. Afferent is sensory pathway. So, as a result of which we will have a stretch reflex. So what will happen? For example, if there is lengthening of the muscle, because lengthening is controlled by the muscle spindle. So whenever there is lengthening, or there is, you can say, contraction, or the muscle is stretched, what will happen? This sudden excitation will go via the sensory route into the spinal cord, and as a result of which a motor response will be generated, and this motor response is going to cause reflex contraction. So if there is stretching, the motor response will be opposite and it will cause contraction. I hope you understood. So now they say that the force of the contraction and the stimulus that they are talking about. Now if the muscle spindle is present, that was the intrafusal fibers, and they had this sensory receptor. So if the sensory receptor is present, you can see that there is a kind of very smooth movement. But if the muscle spindle is not present, the movement will be abrupt. So one thing about the muscle spindle is it is going to have stabilization as well as damping. So what will happen due to damping? That this irregular pattern will be smoothened out, and it will be a pattern like this. That is a smooth and damped pattern. So due to the presence of this muscle spindle in the dynamic and the static stretch reflexes, what will happen? The muscle spindle apparatus is going to prevent the jerky or abnormal motion. It is going to prevent any random activities, random motion. It is going to produce a single straight line motion. That is why the muscle spindle apparatus is very necessary to damp out or to smoothen the whole effect. Second thing is role of the muscle spindle in voluntary motor activity. The same concept then comes over here again, that the extrafusal fibers, they are going to have the alpha motor neurons that are going to stimulate them. That was these efferent fibers we talk about. So extrafusal have alpha motor fibers, whereas the intrafusal fibers, they have these gamma motor fibers. So what will happen now? That if, for example, a dynamic or a stretch reflex is initiated, so both of these fibers will be stimulated side by side. It will not happen that the only external of the fiber is contracting and not the interior. So this voluntary motor activity of the muscle spindle allows both the alpha and gamma motor neurons to work simultaneously and cause the extrafusal along with the intrafusal muscle to be contracted, as a result of which we will have two types of effects. So this co-activation of alpha and gamma motor neurons simultaneously causes extrafusal as well as the intrafusal muscles to contract. So I told you there will be twofold effect of this. Firstly, it keeps the length of the receptor portion of muscle spindle from changing. So for example, if the muscle spindle, the interior fiber I told you, if that keeps on changing, it is going to cause a lot of the reflexes to be initiated. To stop a lot of reflexes, we need to keep this length from changing. So first thing about the voluntary control will be to prevent this muscle spindle length from changing. Second thing is going to be proper damping function, and this damping function I told you is it's going to smooth out and it is going to prevent any haphazard motion. So with the muscle spindle, the motion will be smooth and it will not be any haphazard like this. Now you have brain areas for control of gamma motor system. This is a bulboreticular facilitatory region. So if this is your brain stem, that is your pons, medulla, etc. So from here, this is the bulboreticular facilitatory region. From here, the fibers will go into the cerebellum. The fibers will go into the cerebral cortex, and the fibers will also go into the basal ganglia. So this is also basal ganglia. So cortex, cerebellum and the basal ganglia. And this type of apparatus is going to help in anti-gravity contraction, anti-gravity movement. And as we know that anti-gravity muscles have high density of the muscle spindles, so this region is going to help the muscle spindles to have a contraction and help in walking and running, and also damp the movement, prevent any haphazard movement, and also keep the length of the muscle spindle in its original position. Now after the damping, after the voluntary control, we have muscle spindle system stabilizing the body position during tense actions. So you should always know that most important function of the muscle spindle is to stabilize the body position during any very vigorous type of motor action. For example, if we are running or if we are performing some activity in which our posture is going to be disrupted, so this muscle spindle is now going to act and it will keep our posture in its you can say original position. Now the bulboreticular facilitatory region, it transmits excitatory signals to the gamma nerve fibers to intrafusal muscle fibers. This action shortens the end of the spindles and stretches the central receptor region. So from this bulboreticular region, you can say the impulses are going into the muscle spindle, which cause the central area to elongate, whereas these borders, they are going to shorten up. So this is what is the function of bulboreticular region, to cause the central area to elongate and sides to shorten up. As we can see, shorten the ends and stretch the central receptor region. Due to this, what will happen? The position of the joint becomes strongly stabilized. So this type of stabilization of the body posture is required for delicate and exact positioning, and helps a person to perform muscle functions related to it, like running, like doing movement of the fingers, for intricate motor procedures, etc., which require a lot of the tensile activity. So I told you that the bulboreticular region, for this purpose, to perform the tensile muscular activities, it is going to stretch the central region and it is going to shorten up these side regions of the muscle spindle. Now, clinical related to the stretch reflex. So we have the knee jerk reflex. It is a dynamic type of the stretch reflex. What will happen in this? That a patellar reflex hammer will be touched onto the patellar tendon. So like this, a reflex hammer is touched onto the patellar tendon. And if you know, if the muscle spindle is intact, the patellar tendon is going to go like this, and the fiber will return like this. You know, your leg will return like this. But if the muscle spindle is not intact, there will be oscillation. You know, the leg that was moving forward, now it is, for example, this is our leg and we touch it like this with the patellar tendon, so it is going to move forward. This is the patellar tendon reflex. Now if what happens, that if we touch it and instead of going back or going front, it starts to oscillate like this, so it is the case that the muscle spindle is not intact and the muscle jerks are produced. Muscle jerks are greatly exaggerated in case of weakening of the muscle spindle. As a result of which, what will happen, there are some type of cases like large lesions in the motor area of the cerebral cortex due to strokes, brain tumors. Exaggerated muscle jerks are produced. The motion will not be in a single pathway, rather it will be oscillating like a pendulum. In some situation, muscle jerks can oscillate, and this oscillation is known as the clonus, and we can observe this in the case of a person standing on their tips of the feet or ends of the feet suddenly drop their body downward due to the stretching of the gastrocnemius muscle. Now consider this is the person and this is their feet, and they are standing on the tips of their feet. So what will happen when they are standing on the tips of their feet? The gastrocnemius muscle will be excited. In such a situation, what will happen now? That the muscle spindle will be excited in this situation. Firstly, gastrocnemius is excited. It sends the impulses to the muscle spindle, as the muscle spindle is causing the foot to drop down. Now the foot has dropped down. But again, there will be stretching and the foot will move up, and due to the gastrocnemius re-excitation and muscle spindle, the foot will fall again. So this will keep on happening, and this is known as the clonus, or the oscillating or jerky movement. And it is a dynamic type of the stretch reflex. Clonus occurs in the decerebrate animals, in which the stretch reflexes are highly facilitated. So degree of facilitation determines the degree of the clonus. But in humans, it is uncommon, and whenever you observe a clonus in humans, it means that there is going to be either upper motor neuron lesion or lower motor neuron lesion, etc. One video that I want to show you about the clonus is when the person is lying down and their feet is oscillating like this. So you can see the person is lying down and their muscle is moving like this. So this is a case of clonus, and you can see the movement keeps on happening. So after studying the muscle spindle, we are now going to study the Golgi tendon organ. So as I told you, muscle spindle was where it is coming from inside of the muscle, the intrafusal fibers. But this tendon, it is coming from the Golgi tendon organ is coming from the tendon region. From the tendinous region, a fiber emerges, and this is a sensory nerve which is 16 millimeters, which is a little bit shorter because for the case of muscle spindle it was 17 millimeters. So sensory nerve goes into the sensory root of the spinal cord. From there, it goes into the sensory horn. But in the case of the muscle spindle, what we saw that there was monosynaptic pathway, but here we see that an interneuron is also involved, and this interneuron, the sensory fibers are going to excite this interneuron, but the interneuron is inhibitory to the motor neurons. So a motor neuron is now going to emerge and it will do the relaxation. For example, if there is tension in the Golgi tendon organ, the sensory fibers will go into the spinal cord via the posterior horn or the sensory horn and the sensory root, where they will excite the interneurons. These interneurons are inhibitory interneurons. With their excitation, there will be inhibition of the motor neurons, as a result of which this excitation is now going to cause the relaxation response of the muscle fibers. So this is the whole pathway of the Golgi tendon reflex. And as I told you, the other reflex, that muscle spindle, was associated with length. So now the Golgi tendon reflex is going to be associated with the tension in the muscle. That is why it is going to relieve the tension. So it is a relaxation or relieving response. So similarly, like the muscle spindle had a dynamic and the static response, the Golgi tendon organ is also going to have a dynamic as well as a static response. And in dynamic response, only the primary endings are involved, whereas in the static response, the primary as well as the secondary endings both are involved. Now the whole pathway of transmission, I have explained that to you. 1B fibers are there, which are 16 micrometers, and they will have a sensory cord that will go, and it will have a excitatory connection with the inhibitory neuron. Inhibitory neuron is going to inhibit the anterior motor neuron. It is going to produce a relaxation response, etc. Now I told you that the tendon reflex is going to, whenever there is going to be contraction, the tendon is going to relax the response, produce a relaxation response. So this Golgi tendon organ is actually preventing our body or our tendons against excessive tension on the muscle. Now what will happen in this situation, that if we have excessive tension, inhibitory response will be generated, and this inhibitory response is going to produce a negative feedback, and this is going to cause relaxation. So contraction or increased tension cause inhibitory response to be produced, and inhibitory response cause a negative feedback to be produced, and it causes relaxation. But if there is relaxed fiber, in the relaxed fiber the tension is less, so there is no inhibitory response. No inhibitory response, as a result of which the normal tension in the muscle is maintained. So this pathway, this normal pathway, allows the normal muscle tension to be maintained. That is why I'm able to maintain this posture of my finger. If there was no tension, my finger will always drop down like this. And what will happen? Our body will not be able to maintain a tensile strength in our body, which is required for the movement of blood in the blood vessels and the movement related to food, nutrition, etc. So these two types of the responses are there that we can see. One is the contraction leading to relaxation, other one is the relaxation in which tension is maintained. And this pathway of inhibition is a protective mechanism to prevent the tearing of the muscle or avulsion of the tendon from its attachment of the bone. Because if the tension is going to increase in a rapid manner, and if there is no controlling mechanism, what will happen in such a situation? Our muscles will tear down. So I told you, whenever there will be excess tension, there will be inhibition process and there will be a relaxation. But whenever there is absence of the tension or too little tension, the excitation process will take place and the inhibitory process will not be there. Absence of the reflex inhibition. This phenomena spreads the muscle load, as a result of which the muscles that are too tensed will become relaxed, whereas the muscles which are too relaxed which become a little bit tense. So it will help in the distribution of the tension on the whole muscle. So if you have taken my lectures on the ascending tracts, so there is one tract which goes from your spinal cord into the cerebellum. This was the cerebellum. For example, this was the brain stem. So it goes into the cerebellum. So the pathway going from the spinal cord into the cerebellum, this pathway is sometime having tendon reflexes, or the muscle from the or the information from the muscle tendon. This information is going to keep our cerebellum aware of the degree of the angulation in the joints and help the cerebellum identify the position or the posture of the body and coordinate and produce functions related to it. So this is written over here that sometime Golgi tendon organ sends the you can say fibers to cerebellum, and this pathway has 120 meters per second speed. This is the very fast pathway, and it keeps the cerebellum aware of the position of the body, allows feedback control of the motor signals. This whole information is going to keep our body posture in the normal position. So now what is flexor reflex and what is withdrawal reflex? Whenever you read the spinal cord, you come across this mechanism that the spinal cord is going to control one specific reflex. That is, for example, you touch a hot object and you pull your hand away from that object. That response or that thing is known as the flexor response. It is for the limbs like the upper limb, lower limb. Whenever it is going to touch a hot object, this pain pathway will be activated and it will pull the hand away from the hot object. This is the flexor response. But whenever, for example, if our face is involved, if our chest is involved, in such a situations, we need to withdraw our body from that hot region. But in such situations, the reflex will not be known as a flexor reflex, rather it will be known as a withdrawal reflex. So it is as simple as that. And I told you that this flexor reflex, since it is involving the pain pathway, so it can also be called as the nociceptive reflex, because any type of reflex, any type of pain, any type of hot object that is going to cause your body part to move away, that type of reflex is known as the flexor reflex. Even certain type of the touch receptors may be involved, like if you are touching a very sharp object and you will pull your hand away from that object, so in such a situation touch receptors will be involved. So nociceptor, pain reflexes and touch receptors may be involved in the flexor reflex. So I have written over here, for example, if the limbs are involved, that will be flexor reflex. If other body parts are involved, it will be a withdrawal reflex. Now there are going to be neuronal mechanism of the flexor reflex. How the flexor reflex is going to be produced. So now what happens that there is the spinal cord interneuronal pool. And what happens? Firstly, a sensory information goes via the sensory horn. So you can see this is our flexor reflex. You see the pain stimulus from the hand, it goes via the sensory route over here. In this pathway, you can see that there is going to be a lot of neurons and a lot of synapses. And these synapses are going to, stretch the anterior muscle or the flexor ones and inhibit the extensor one. So stretch or flexion of the or excitation of the flexor muscles and inhibition of the extensor muscle will take place. That is why it is a flexor reflex, because the flexor muscles are being excited. So there are three types of things that are going to take place. Firstly is the diverging circuit. Secondly is the inhibition, that is known as reciprocal inhibition, and thirdly is the after discharge. Let me explain that to you via the diagram. So you see a response goes via the sensory receptors and it is going by the sensory nerve. Now first thing is happening, you can see a lot of interneurons being involved. This is known as diverging. So diverging is happening and it is going to spread your whole pathway or the whole, you can say the whole reflex. Second thing is going to be reflex inhibition. That is, you are going to excite the flexors whereas you are going to inhibit the extensors, and this is known as reciprocal inhibition. So first thing was divergence, other thing was reciprocal inhibition, and third thing is the after discharge. So sometimes there is after discharge. After discharge means that you want to keep your hand away from that object even after you have removed your hand from that object. This excessive, or you can say an after discharge or an external stimuli that keeps on happening even in the absence of the stimulus, or a response that keeps on happening even in the absence of the stimulus, this after discharge maintains your body and it will help you to run away or move away from the painful stimulus. And after that, what will happen? There will be a sharp decline in the contraction. Firstly, when there was a very for example, if there was a stimulus coming, so the stimulus causes a flexor response to be generated, and this flexor response firstly causes divergence, then it causes reflex inhibition. After that, it causes an after discharge. After discharge is even in the absence of the stimulus, and after the after discharge there is the fatigue of the stimulus. That is, now the flexion or now the flexor response is going to end itself. This is the myogram of the flexor reflex. So it has divergence, then reflex inhibition, then an after discharge, and then the fatigue. And the duration of this after discharge depends on the intensity of the sensory stimulus. The weak stimulus is going to cause an after discharge which is going to be low and it will have a small time period. But whenever the intensity of the stimulus becomes too large, you can see how long the after discharge is in that situation. So you can say that the duration of the stimulus or the strength of the stimulus is going to measure the amount of the after discharge. Now for the withdrawal reflex, for example, it is your arm. So what will happen that now in the withdrawal reflex, not only the flexor muscles but also another type of muscle will be involved. So for example, this was your arm and a hot object touched your arm. So firstly the flexor muscle will be activated, then along with that there will be an abductor muscle that will be activated. So your brain and your spinal cord, because it's a reflex, so it will be controlled by spinal cord mostly. So the spinal cord is going to decide to make sure that there is an integrative function, and all the groups of muscle that are going to pull your body part away from that painful stimulus, they are going to be involved in that withdrawal reflex. For the leg they will be different, for the face they will be different, for the trunk they will be different. So pattern of the withdrawal reflex is the integration of your spinal cord to mainly activate all the groups of muscles that are going to move your body away from the painful stimulus.